So again, my name's Chris Bernier, as Ron said, and I work with Vermont Fish and Wildlife. I've worked with the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department since 1994 and have played a variety of roles, played a variety of roles with the department since starting. More recently, I have been the fur bearer biologist for the state and held that position for approximately 6 years until this past year, where my predecessor in the position came back to the position, and I then took on the turkey project as well. So I went from fur bearers to turkey. I have a lot of learning to do with turkeys, but they're a fun species to work with. I still work in the fur bearer project. I still play a pretty central role to a number of the functions of fur bearer management in the state, including marten, as we're going to talk about tonight, and lynx, which I was talking about here last year. But I also get involved in all of the data collection on fur bearers. Does everyone know what I mean when I say fur bearers? That's a word that's probably a little antiquated maybe, but it refers to a legal classification of animals here in the state that were either historically or are contemporarily harvested primarily for their fur. So there are 17 species that fall into the fur bearer project purview, ranging from the weasel to the wolf and everything in between. Fisher, otter, bobcat, mink, raccoon, skunk, possum, coyote, red fox, gray fox. Probably missed a couple in there. Marten, beaver, how could I miss that one? So as you might imagine, working in the fur bearer project is a multifaceted project. There's never a dull day, a lot of things going on. But that being said, we do focus a lot of our attention on several species in particular that are at risk or not numerous in the state or have discernible risks that we can predict are down the road for them. And one of them is the American marten. And I talk about at numbers of functions through the course of the year. I give a number of presentations about beaver and bobcat and this, that, and the other thing. But I will say that talking about marten I find to be one of the more enjoyable species to talk about. And it's primarily because the story of marten here in Vermont is really uniquely Vermont. I mean, it's a really fascinating story, and it embodies really everything that, the history of fur bearers, way back in time to present. It embodies the history of the department and the work that we do. It embodies, the interaction with people in the landscape and the challenges that we have ahead for animals. So it's really really a perfect species to focus on to give you a taste of what fur bearer management is in the state. And I will say up front, I'm preloading this conversation tonight with that it's a success story. It's not over. The story is far from over, but to present, it's a success story. But before I get too far down the road into this, I just wanted to thank Otter Creek Audubon Society for having me back again. I really appreciate that. I recognize a few of you from my talk last time, I believe. And thank you for elevating these conversations in the community. It's excellent stuff. And looking through the board here and seeing all the contributions to conservation, birds and salamander alike, is really outstanding. So kudos to Otter Creek Audubon. And then looking at the number of people that are here, which is not bad for a random Thursday night, after how many nor'easters? 6? I don't know, 3? Feels like more than 3. But I would say that, and it dawned on me as people were coming in, I'm like, this is unique to Vermont too. That people, well, it's not perfectly unique to Vermont. I mean, a lot of people care about wildlife across the globe. But I find in Vermont that wildlife really is a galvanizing subject. People really come together and enjoy, appreciate, and are intrigued by wildlife of all sorts. And I would suggest that this is an example of that. People taking the time out of their schedules on a Thursday night to be here to listen to me ramble on. I'll try not to ruin the evening for you in that respect. But so we're going to talk about American marten, and Pine marten, you'll hear it referred to as well, quite commonly. It is a mustelid from the family Mustelidae, which is the weasel family. So it's related to otter, mink, fisher, long-tail weasel, short-tail weasel. They're all in the family Mustelidae. And they all have that weasel-like body, right? That long, skinny, almost accordion-like body. They don't seem to have a backbone at times. They're just kind of like this. And they're relatively short-legged animals, pointed face. The American marten is somewhat unique in that it is uniquely adapted to an arboreal existence, meaning a life in trees. So this animal is adept in the trees, and having semi-retractile unsheathed claws would be an adaptation for a life in trees. So when it does come down onto the ground, those claws don't come in contact with the ground and dull them. So when they're up in the tree, they have unbelievable traction. They're also an animal of the north, which we're going to talk about more in a second, but when you look at their fur, and I'll pass this around so you can all feel it, it is really developed for a cold climate. It's an incredible fur to feel, very thick and plush. They have fully furred feet, so the soles of their feet, just like a Canada lynx, which is also a northern species, has fully furred feet, which can make it very difficult to track marten because they don't leave very definitive track impressions, like say a coyote, where you can see the pads. You can tell by the pattern that it's a mustelid, but because of the size similarity between marten and mink, sometimes it's hard to differentiate one track from the other, and then you're forced to look at habit and habitat to try to figure out which is which there. Uh-oh. There it is. So they are a fairly small animal, as you can tell from the pelt I passed around, and from this guy here. You can see he's got the accordion shape right there, right? All bunched up, ready to jump somewhere. Fairly small, about the size of a mink, like I've already said. And they have a couple really distinct features despite a wide variety of pelage color. So they are generally brown. Sometimes they're even almost orange. Like this one here, you can see on the throat patch is very orange, but even the back is somewhat orange. People have described them as looking like a red fox even. And I've seen them almost black, really dark. And this one here, again, is kind of a tan, as you can see. But despite the variety of general coloration, they have a few absolute distinct features that are always there. And one is this throat patch. And this is a very large one. You'll see in the pictures as I go through that they come in all shapes and sizes. In fact, Vermont is hoping to participate in a study coming down the pipe, look to use throat patches like a fingerprint, if you will, because every throat patch is going to be a little different shape. And if we can get photos using game cameras of these animals, then we can tell individuals and start to develop essentially diaries of their use of the landscape and try to figure out densities of them. But they also have this really short, kind of inverted teardrop. It's sticking straight up in the corner of their eye. And it gives them kind of a chronic inquisitiveness, right? And I was looking, what? Who said that? But I have to say that they are probably the cutest of the fur bearers, right? I mean, look at that. So they have the standard reproductive history of the mustelids, again, the family Mustelidae, the weasel family, which is that of a delayed implanter. And it's quite unique. Has anyone heard of delayed implantation here? A couple of you have. So what it is, it's a mechanism by which an animal, such as a marten or fisher, an otter, will breed, they'll mate, and the eggs will be fertilized, but they're not implanted into the uterus. They're held in limbo for a long period of time until it comes back around and through the winter, getting in toward early spring, before that fertilized egg is actually implanted into the uterus and begins to grow and develop. So they breed, as you can see here, in June and through early July, and that's the advantage. It gives them this big window of time for them to breed, whereas a lot of animals have a very narrow breeding opportunity. So they have a long period of time that they can breed. The female becomes pregnant. The fertilized egg is held in limbo until February. Once it's implanted, it develops rapidly. It's a 27-day post-implantation gestation, which is pretty quick. And then you have 1 to 5 altricial, completely dependent young born shortly thereafter in March. The adult males, I'm embarrassed to say, do not assist with raising young. They should be ashamed of themselves. So they are also rapid growers. So they can go from 1 ounce at birth to full body weight in 3 months' time, which is really tremendous growth. They're weaned in 42 days and ready to be out of the den in 50 days, and then actually dispersing from their natal colony, from their natal group, into the fall of that first year, which is pretty remarkable. Female marten will actually become sexually mature at 1.5, which is not too dissimilar from a lot of other animals, which it seems like it'd be a little earlier. And you can see here, this is going to give away a talking point later, but they are cavity nesters, similar to a lot of birds. In fact, they use a lot of bird nests, or bird cavities, for their nests. And they will find cavities where the hole is just small enough so they can get in and out, but it restricts fisher from getting in and out, because fisher will eat these guys. But they're not always looking for logs on the ground like this. They'll use standing snags. They will sometimes use rocky, craggy, earth to actually den underground, and even sometimes under the root wads of those big old yellow birches that you see occasionally out in the national forest, where the roots are just kind of like they create a little maze underneath the tree. But generally they are looking for cavity nesting opportunities, and it can be in some places the limiting factor for their occupancy of that area.
How large a hole would you expect that they would be in?
2 inches or 1.75 inches.
Inch and 3/4.
Yeah.
If you made something like left it out in the woods somewhere, would they use something like that?
They actually do, and we've talked about doing that ourselves. We haven't fully vetted it, but in Minnesota, they've taken to putting out nest boxes, like a wood.
Trees at a certain
Yep,
height?
absolutely. Specifically in forests where that's a limiting factor. And here in Vermont, where we have them, I don't think it's a limiting factor, but if we want to grow them beyond their current distribution, we may need to consider that, and we are considering it. But I also failed to say that the marten, like fisher, are sexually dimorphic, meaning that the sexes are very different sizes. So the female is literally half the size of a male. And so the hole that she needs for a nest is tiny. And they're a weasel. They can slip through a small hole, and the male can't get in. So despite being primarily carnivorous animals, that is, primarily carnivorous animals, their diet is quite variable through the season. So they're an opportunistic feeder. They're not a generalist feeder like some animals like the lynx, or they're not a specialist feeder, like the lynx, which eats only snowshoe hare. A generalist feeder eats a lot of stuff. But they'll eat any number of nuts and berries as they're available, vegetation of different sorts. But they do tend to focus on the voles, the small mammals, the mice, squirrels, even snowshoe hare, birds. Careful there. And in particular, in the winter, This is kind of cool, I think. They focus on the redback vole, which is a common vole here in Vermont, and it spends its time in the winter under the snow. And you'll see its evidence as the snow melts in the spring with these little tunnels. Meadow voles will do this too, but they're in kind of different habitats. The redback vole will utilize woody debris that's on the forest floor, and when that gets covered with snow, there's all these little spaces in and amongst the woody debris that they can tunnel around in. And being a weasel, as it is, with that long skinny body and its unique adaptations for this, the marten can actually go subnivean under the snow and hunt redback voles, and it will spend a significant amount of its time under snow hunting redback voles in the winter, which gives it a distinct advantage from other carnivores that live in these areas. And so where you have these deep snows and redback voles and the woody debris, that's great habitat for a marten.
They don't hibernate?
No, no. They actually thrive in winter. It's their favorite month, or favorite season, I'm sure. I mean, I've never asked one that, but I'm only guessing. So they are broadly distributed, as you can see here, right across the entire northern North America. They're subarctic, boreal forests, the northern transitional temperate forests. There's actually 2 species currently. This is always evolving, right? This trying to figure out how many species or subspecies. The common understanding now is that there's 2 distinct species: the American marten, which is this one here, and that, that's here in Vermont, but all the way across over here, that's all American marten. And then there's the Pacific marten, all these little dots down here in California and the Rockies. That's Pacific marten. And they're very similar, but genetically distinct at the same time. And when you look at their home range size, the males and females have different home range sizes as well, right? Females have about half the home range as a male. But when you look at it in comparison, it seems like a small home range compared to a lot of the fur bearers. But when you look at it in comparison to their size, 1 to 3 pounds, it's actually a pretty impressive home range size. For a large male, we'll say they go 4.5 pounds for a large male marten, which would be a big one, to have a 1,400-acre area that little animal patrols and defends against other male marten, not female marten, but defends against other male marten. That's pretty impressive. So when beyond, I think I've said it several times already, they have a propensity for cold climates, right? The subarctic, northern temperate, and boreal forest. Beyond that, there are a few habitat features that they really need, and one of them is they need deep interior forests. This species requires large swaths of interior forest. They avoid openings, particularly the females, even to the extent of a road. Females will stay off of roadsides. They set up their home ranges based on roads in their area, so their home range fits neatly in and around, outside of the roads. But they also need a mature forest. It doesn't have to be old growth, but a mature forest. So a forest that on average is at least 60% or better intermediate life stage or old growth forest. So it's on that far end of the spectrum. And the reason for that is because there are several features that an older forest present for marten. Number one, you have a lot of woody debris on the ground, right? So when you have a forest that's old, things die, fall over, end up on the ground, that becomes redback vole habitat, small mammal habitat in general. That's where you find all your squirrels in and amongst the woody debris. So think food, think foraging, lots of woody debris, big trees on the ground. Also cavity nesters or cavity nests. Those older forests have the trees that die or become hollow and become nesting cavities. But also those older forests have a structure, unlike a younger or more managed forest, that is diverse. So it's not only a vertical structure, meaning there's multiple age classes up through to the canopy. So you have, you're beaten down through, the undergrowth, but yet there's still a mid-story above you, and then above that another layer of the canopy. That's called a vertical structure. These older forests tend to have that. When a big tree falls down the forest, the light flushes in, you get another little burst of growth underneath. Those are all features that marten really hone in on.
That looks like a good southeaster there on top.
Yeah, it does. They like southeasters, there's no doubt about it. Here in Vermont, where we have this meshing of cold and snow and these forest features, you can almost predict what I'm going to say, where those exist. It's in the Green Mountain spine. Those higher elevations, very cold, very deep snow. I can tell you safely there's some serious snow up in the Green Mountains today. And that will benefit marten. There's no doubt about it. And here in southern Vermont, where we have the Aiken Wilderness, the Big Branch Wilderness, the Peru Peak Wilderness, the Glastonbury Wilderness, I may be even missing some here, but there's a lot of wilderness area in southern Vermont, in the National Forest, that is ideal habitat for marten because it is in that intermediate and old growth stage forest, if that makes sense. But also in the Northeast Kingdom, we have, it's further north, lots of snow as well, and particularly at the higher elevations that the timber harvesting history there has been less intense. Sometimes down in the lower parts of the terrain there, it's still a younger forest, and so it's a little bit spotty for marten. But you get upslope where the intensity of the history of logging has been less, there you get into some decent habitat up there. So this is a common theme throughout the whole presentation, is the importance of snow. We really feel strongly that it is one of the limiting factors. It's what makes or breaks the species here for a number of reasons. I mean, clearly an animal that lives just subarctic and through the boreal forest is an animal of the north, just like Canada lynx. So it's going to be adapted to a life in the snow. And those adaptations give it an advantage over its fiercer, that's not a good way of putting it, more successful southern cousin, we'll call it, the fisher. They are pretty closely related. We had some, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit, but we had some cameras set in Branch Pond area down in the southern Green Mountain National Forest. Beautiful area, fun to go visit if you're ever out and about in southern Vermont. And these cameras were set specifically for marten, and we have a snow stake at the camera so we can measure snow depth. Every time it captures a photo, it captures the snow depth. And we had one of these, this was several winters ago, we had this deep powdery snow, and we had marten. Every photo was marten. We had a big warm spell, a January thaw, or maybe it actually was later, I think it was toward the end of February, a thaw, a rain event. You could see the snow just dropped away from the snow stake, solidified, packed, never saw a marten again. It was all fisher from there on out. That's, one example of many that we can draw from that would indicate that that's the ebb and flow that takes place. And winter being a challenging time of year for all wildlife, as you can imagine. Those adaptations that marten have to give them an edge is what makes or breaks it. And so if you have a short winter or those warming spells and it allows a fisher to come in and compete and even predate, that's a limiting factor. So this seems a little out of place, I guess, but again, in my introductory remarks saying that the story of marten is really kind of the story of fur bearers and the story of people here. And so you have to go back in time and look at our history. And I know that a lot of what I'm going to say over the next several slides, you all probably know inherently. But it's worth repeating because of the importance of this history on where we are today and the challenges that we are faced with today. So pre-European contact, Native Americans lived throughout the state, as we all know, and they lived sustainably in a landscape that was largely forested, 90-95% forested landscape, probably mostly old growth, certainly older forest, colder environment, had the whole suite of species. It wasn't missing any parts of the cogs, right? It had the wolf and the mountain lion. It had the Canada lynx, the marten. It had them all. And marten thrived at that time. But meanwhile, across the seas, things weren't quite so pretty with respect to the landscape. You know, there was, well, let me say as well that the fur trade and the history of it to present is worth a presentation on its own. I mean, there's a lot to be learned and a lot to be, you know, understood there, I guess, about that history. And I don't have the time tonight to go into great detail, so I'm just going to gloss over a few of the key things. One of the key things here is that in the Middle Ages, the 1300s in Europe, at that point, fur had finally made that transition from that of a necessity, right? So it was an item of absolute necessity for early peoples around the globe. But fur had made a transition from that of a necessity that sustained people to that of a commodity. So it became a currency. In the Middle Ages, the more fur you had, the more fur you owned, the wealthier you were and the more successful you were. It was still a necessity. They didn't have all the variety of clothes that we have today. They still wore fur, but it was a trading currency. There were no rules and regulations about the taking of fur-bearing animals. Absolutely none. It's a free-for-all. The more you could harvest, the wealthier you would be. And so by the Middle Ages, and even into the 1500s, they had decimated all their fur populations. All the fur bearers were gone, and they also decimated a lot of the habitat. And so a lot of those first early European explorers that set sail off their shores to come to North America were actually funded by prospectors for new populations of fur bearers. That was a principal funder for early exploration, and other resources as well, but principally fur. And you can only imagine what those first European explorers discovered when they got here, right? They first discovered a population of indigenous people that were literally living in the Stone Age. So the Europeans coming across the ocean were in the Iron Age. They had guns, they had axes, they had knives, kettles. They had all the things that as soon as the Native Americans saw, they knew they needed to have them, because you can only imagine what that meant for the simplicity of their life and how they sustained themselves. But what the Europeans didn't have that the natives did was the knowledge of this landscape, the travelways, the waterways, the fur bearer populations, and all the tools that they had here, because they've been using fur bearers sustainably for millennia. In fact, there's evidence that early peoples migrated. Some of their migration patterns was dictated by populations of fur bearers, both seasonally and even over years. At any rate, you can imagine that it didn't take long for there to be a system of trade between native peoples and European explorers that was powerful, right? 10 beaver pelts would get you a gun. 1 beaver pelt would get you a half a pound of powder, or 4 pounds of shot, or a pound of tobacco, or half a pound of beads. I mean, there was a whole barter system that took place. So when those European ships came over the seas, they were full of Iron Age wares and tobacco and all the other things as well, and they would trade with the natives, fill their holds full of fur, and head right back over the ocean. It did not take long for our fur resources, our fur bearers here in North America, to get decimated. And by the time those first wagon trains made their way out west in the early 19th century, looking for a new place to settle, there were no fur bearers here. And you look at the list, whoops, well, sorry, the list is a few slides up yet. Simultaneous to all of this, and maybe a little bit belated, there was a second affront, particularly for those animals that are deep forest dwelling species, animals that will not exist on a landscape that has 25% or more open space on it, right? So you know the story. right? Vermont was settled quick and hard, as was most of the Northeast. 1760, they estimated about 3,000 or less European settlers. And these are agrarian people. They cleared land to provide sustenance for themselves. By 1790, that grew to 85,000, and by 1800, 4 decades later, 155,000 people. And at that point, 75% of the state was fields, was open land, pasture. So clearly the animals that had perhaps escaped unregulated harvest for the fur trade had a second to front on the habitat. They just didn't stand a chance. And the list is staggering, and this is by no means an exhaustive list. And I always hesitate to put it up there because it seems so depressing. This whole history I just walked through is a little bit depressing. There's no doubt about it. But again, this is a success story we're talking about here in the end. But I feel compelled to put this list up here because it is a stark reminder to people of the human capacity to alter our habitat, alter our landscape. And it can't be overstated, and we cannot forget that. And looking at marten specifically, we have several early natural historians, fortunately, here in Vermont, that documented that decline. You know, Samuel Williams in 1794 said they were in large numbers. And then, 50 some odd years later, Zadok Thompson says the clearing and settling has much reduced their numbers. And then finally, 1938, Frederick Osgood says they're nearly extinct. And when you look at the last known occurrences of these species that are even remotely verifiable, this one here I don't believe is verifiable. The red ones were. You can see where they were centered in southern Vermont. This Glastonbury here, this whole area is a high elevation area. Probably amongst the last, I don't know this for a fact, but probably amongst the last to have been cleared because of its remote nature. Actually, I think there was a Middlebury College professor, I don't know if it was Steve Trombulak, I can't remember who did it, that did a GIS analysis of the state of Vermont to find the most remote part of the state. And we all think about the Northeast Kingdom, right? Oh, it's beautiful, wilderness up there. Well, this is it, right there. Glastonbury Wilderness, the greatest distance from roads, houses, so on and so forth. So the good news is that the good news, I guess the silver lining is that it does take us humans a little bit of time, but we do eventually wake up and smell the coffee, right? Like, what have we done? It takes that kind of wholesale liquidation of a resource before we realize that, maybe this wasn't the smartest approach. And things started to turn around. There was a collective change of our consciousness, an awakening amongst people, not just Vermonters, but across the country, I'm sure. One galvanizing moment in time, in 1842, there was a Supreme Court case called Marten versus Waddell, which established, importantly, still today, that wildlife here in this country is not to be privately owned. It is a public trust resource to be managed by public entity for the people. So that's a key thing. That's very unique across the globe. And then that laid the groundwork. Once you had that ruling and that mandate, you had to have agencies, both federal and state, to take on this responsibility of protecting these species for people. And we had essentially no animals left at that point. So they were creating seasons like the first beaver season in 1910. There were no beaver here. So they created a beaver season for the harvest of beaver and closed it the same day. But you get the point, yeah.
Do you know how we compare in that area to Canada and to Europe?
As far as
establishing endangered species laws, like you said, fur bears were just decimated
right.
around the Middle Ages, and then they came here. So
It's still very different across the seas. their populations are still, I mean, I'm by no means an expert on European fur bearer populations, so take that as the caveat, but my understanding is that they still struggle with fur bearers there. There's a lot of fur bearers that have not recovered there, as they have here.
And how about
Canada
Canada too?
never really experienced the full brunt of decimation that we did here, and it's really primarily because of just access and remoteness and vastness, and a hard place to settle. So, you know, there's a lot of things that were different, but Canada has a very similar system of public ownership of wildlife.
It just seems that more and more we need to have a global perspective on everything.
Oh, absolutely.
And so that's why I'm asking.
Absolutely. But a lot of pieces fell into, pieces of the puzzle fell into place. We had the Lacey Act of 1900, which established, that outlawed trade in wildlife of certain types, illegally taken wildlife. We had seasons set and closed. We had wildlife agencies like Vermont Fish and Wildlife established and staffed and funded. In 1937, there was an incredibly critical funding bill at the federal level called the Pittman-Robertson Act, which basically generated an excise tax at the manufacturer level of guns and ammunition and sporting goods, essentially, that was collected and held specifically for states in use of wildlife conservation and restoration. It's still today our principal funder. 75% essentially of our funding comes from this fund. All these things turned the tides, right? We started reintroducing animals, beaver. We began in the 20s to reintroduce beaver around the state, and they're everywhere now. I can tell you stories about beaver. Maybe we'll do another beaver talk sometime. That's a fun one. Fisher, the story goes on. And then we partnered before getting into that, in 1972, we listed marten as an endangered species, thinking essentially that they were not here. But they still warranted the protection of that law, recognizing that they were native to the state. Then we partnered with the U.S. Forest Service, the Green Mountain National Forest, recognizing that the bulk of the habitat that was available for the species here in the state was on national forest land. And they're a key partner still today on all of this. So, and I didn't say this early on, and I had intended to, that this story is not mine alone. There's been a long, as far as the more contemporary part of the story that we're moving into, the Forest Service, my predecessor, Kim Royer. We have a whole team of people that have been working on marten conservation for a number of years now. Forest Service principally among them. And one of the core functions of this recovery plan was a reintroduction, just like we did with these other species before them. So the first part of that was to assess the habitat statewide to figure out where it made sense to reintroduce them. There's a lot of time and effort and money and risk for the individual animals that you're taking out of their native and you're putting them into some foreign place. So you really have to do your due diligence to make sure that you've crossed all your T's and dotted your I's so that you get the best possible results that you can get. So we assessed the whole state, and it's no coincidence that southern Vermont became obvious rapidly that it was one of the better places to do a reintroduction. And there were several reasons for it. Just so folks know here going forward that these two circles here are ultimately reintroduction sites. And you're going to see those circles carry through on different maps. So every time you see the red circle, that's a reintroduction site. This green, the highlighted green is the national forest. This is Somerset Reservoir. This is Route 11 from Manchester, Vermont, over to Chester. Route 103 corridor toward Rutland, just to give you some idea. But anyway, this area was decided to be the best place. It's public land. That's great when you're trying to reintroduce an endangered species. It's better if it's on public land, if you can start there. Great habitat. There was wilderness areas established, so it's perfect. High elevation, deep snows, and importantly, at the time, less fisher, which is a prime competitor. So we worked with our neighbors to the north and to the south, New York and Maine, to collect using citizen trappers, contract trappers, to live trap 115 animals, 11 of which were from New York, the remainder were from northern Maine. And this is where I came into the picture just as this, well, I guess it was just, well, don't worry about me in the picture. But importantly here, there were only 27 females. The goal in the recovery plan was to get at 30. But females are hard to catch, female marten in particular, because one, they avoid open areas, right? So they're more in the interior forest, and so that's an access issue, right? You gotta lug your cage traps, which are big, and for marten you gotta have a good sized trap, and there's a lot of equipment to go with it, because they're susceptible to trap myopathy. They, even in a have-a-heart trap, they don't like it, they don't fare well. And so you have to bring lots of covering, you actually stuff wool into it so they can wrap up. It's a weird thing. It has to do with the trap and the stress level in that trap, even a cage trap. And so trying to capture females where you lug all that stuff into a more remote area becomes a challenge, and they're more trap shy to begin with. So you can see the bias, 88 males to 27 females. And at some point we had to cut it, say, oh, this is what we got, we're going to give it a whirl. So we were 3 shy. Actually, we had one female chew its way out of its holding box in the Springfield airport. So we were actually 28. So we brought them into these 2 circles that you saw on the map, and we released them in 2 different manners. So there were 40 of them were slow releases. So they were kept in these cages that you see, and they were spread out more than just that. There were, well, there's 40 of them, so we had them spread out through the forest where we had access. Minimal human activity. So kept people out of there except for what we needed to just keep them fed. They were kept there for a period of, I forget what it was. It wasn't a long period, but a week or 2 at best. And then eventually the door would be opened, and would keep putting food into the cage, right, for a period of time until they stopped coming back. So it's a slow release.
What did you feed them?
Beaver, primarily.
So it's raw beaver meat?
Yeah, yeah. And I had not come onto the scene here. This is 1989 through 1991. I started in '94, as I said earlier. And then 75 of them were quick releases, like the one in the Springfield airport. That was a fairly quick release. This here, I think, is a quick release too. This is my predecessor, Kim Royer, who did the reintroduction effort, and now she's the fur bearer biologist, or the chair of the fur bearer team. We're both fur bearer biologists, but she chairs the fur bearer team. So we did a bunch of follow-up monitoring, and we're still doing this today. Some really stunning things here. So all of these animals were ear tagged so that they could be identified later, right, if they turned up wherever they may turn up. That's important information. So we had, this one in Candia, New Hampshire, 145 kilometers away, 7 months after the release, 160 kilometers down in Bakersville, Connecticut. Now that's a confused animal, I'd say. And then this animal, which was actually taken from the Adirondacks, relocated here, and then went north to Rangeley, Maine. Interesting stuff. That was 8 years after the release. That animal turned up.
They live for a long time.
Yeah, what's their lifespan?
Well, that would be topping out right there. It was obviously a juvenile when it was relocated. They're not a particularly long-lived animal. I would say that's pushing the length of a wild animal, a wild marten, at 8, maybe 10 years. Yeah. But
Very
this,
healthy.
what's that?
Travel that far, he's very healthy.
Incredible journey. But this tells us a few important things. Number one, it tells us that, well, they didn't all stay as we had hoped. And number two, it says that, it informed us that they are capable of long-distance dispersal. This is an animal that can move across the landscape quite a distance. And number two, it also, particularly this one, I think, indicates that there's even the potential of a dispersal corridor, right? When an animal can meander its way over 8 years through the landscape, that's a dispersal corridor, which is important for the long-term conservation of these species to maintain connectivity. But we also radio collared 12 of the marten, and this is again in the late 80s, early 90s, and so radio telemetry, electronics in general, weren't what they are today. This is a marten collar here. I'll pass it around. It's all VHF, meaning it's land-based. There's no satellite communication. You have to be within, a matter of 1,000 yards or less to pick this up with a radio receiver. And these areas that we release these animals in are remote. They're rugged. They're high elevation. Trying to get back out and to get some confirmation that you had any of these animals still there was a real challenge. And the technology was also finicky. Batteries died, things fell off, there's a lot of issues there. But we did manage to pick up 9 of the 12 post-release. And we're able to determine that 4 actually established home ranges, that they actually started defending and stayed put. So this tells us that, yeah, definitely some stayed back, which is awesome. So with that information, we said, well, we need to go another step to figure out what's going on. And so we, again, partnered with the National Forest and their Northern Research Station, or the Northern Forest Research Station, which is based out of UMass. And again, this is before modern digital camera technology, right? So there's no game cameras. That wasn't even a word of the day. We had to figure out, we thought that camera technology would be our best monitoring effort. So we tested 2 different camera setups, one that was homemade. Myself, this is when I came on board, myself and the graduate student we actually bought a bunch of cameras for the test and hardwired trigger plates into it. So we take the button off and hardwired in a trigger plate, so it's a pressure plate. You put pressure on the plate remotely and it snaps the photo. Then the plate was mounted in one end of a big rectangle wooden box, and in the other end the camera was mounted. And that was then bolted to a tree as high as you can get it, and then a pole was set into the end of that box where the trigger plate was, and then there was bait placed in the end. So the idea was that you have film camera, 36 exposure at best, maybe 48, I don't remember, but every photo is a valuable photo, right? And if you just set something out there, every chickadee or anything that comes by is going to snap your photos. And so we needed to have some system of limiting what would get a photo taken of itself. And it worked. It actually worked really well. But the other camera type that we tested, I'm referring to this part of the study. This was the piloting of the methodology in 1995. The other camera that we tested was an actual commercially available early game camera, and it used an infrared beam that if you broke the beam, it would snap the photo. It was like a security camera. So we had that mounted up on a tree with the transmitter with the radio, the infrared beam here, and the receiver over here, and then the camera back here, all wired together, crazy with bait, and then a blue jay would come and land right in the middle, and just 36 photos done. So it didn't work out so well. Not to mention leaves and snow, chipmunks. But at any rate, at the end of that pilot study, we did pick up 2 ear-tagged marten, which was great. I mean, we were hoping to get an un-ear-tagged marten because that would indicate reproduction. But we still at that point with 40 cameras, only 20 of which were the box that I first described, the better one. Only 20 of them were that. But we picked up 2 marten, and 55% of the camera sites had Fisher on it, which was a little concerning, but not far off of what we thought would be the case, based on seeing Fisher tracks and stuff around in those areas. So using the better camera design, we then did a more robust study in 1997 through 98, where we put out 50 cameras, but bear destroyed 3 of them right off the top. So we ended up with 47 baited and scent lured cameras, and they were out for pretty much the whole winter, rebaited, re-scent lured several times through the winter. We didn't detect any marten at all. Fisher were detected at 97 of those cameras. So something happened between 1995 and 1997. And I think that it was happening all along. We just got these two little snapshots in this greater window of change. Still changing today. But, so what happened? Well, we had a relatively recently reintroduced population of fisher, right? They were reintroduced starting in the 60s, I think it was. Is that right? Maybe late 50s, early 60s. So they were still potentially expanding. We thought that at that point they had pretty much saturated the quality habitat that was available to them, but maybe they were still expanding. We had in the late 80s, early 90s, the peak of anti-fur, anti-trapping activity in the European Union, primarily, and that spilled over to all of North America, including Canada. Fur markets just collapsed. Trappers, we went from 3,000 licensed trappers in the late 80s to 300 in the early 90s. And fisher are a relatively easy species to catch, and they're relatively valuable. So trappers target fisher quite a bit. And so we had a marked reduction in fisher trapping in that period of time too, which very possibly could have resulted in a population expansion, especially a population that was still expanding, perhaps even from a reintroduction. And we also had a series of warmer winters, which would benefit fisher. They don't do so well in the deep snow as marten do. So all these things came together, and in the end of the day, everyone, and this is a quote from Trina Maruzzi, the graduate student who did the study, quote from her published research was that few, if any, animals survived, the marten survived, primarily as a result of what we believe to be competition and predation by fisher. So that was, a bit of a blow. But the story does get better. I told you this is a success story. I promise there's success here. So we were limping along since the mid-90s thinking that nothing really was going on. We had, well, before I even get into that, I want to describe the next few slides deal with what I call detections or occurrences. And in the context of this, you need to know what that is. So a detection or occurrence could be someone seeing an animal and gathering physical evidence like a photo. With marten, really got to have a photo because tracks are iffy because of their cross with mink and even a small fisher. Or body in hand, such as one that was hit by a car. And in the case of marten, one caught in a trap that was set for fisher. So fisher and marten occupy similar habitats, partitioned somewhat by snow, but they eat the same things. They have very similar habits. They both are climbers. And so when you have a trap that is set for a larger fisher, it's hard to keep a smaller marten out of it. Does that make sense? I say that with caution because people often take that and run with that and say, I knew traps are non-selective. They catch everything. There are suites of species that's the case. Fisher and marten, beaver and otter. You still can. There are things you can do to minimize the catch of one when you're trying to target another. But you're in the same habitat and you have species with similar habits. The chances of it still happening are there. So some of these detections that I'm going to go through are that. They are incidental captures by trappers who, I might add, turn these animals in, which is awesome. For us, it's a boon of information. So we had one that actually was a trap take in 1997, but that was not that big of a surprise because we knew that here in northern New Hampshire and in the estuary region of Quebec here, that there was a small persistent population of marten. In fact, one of the reasons why we didn't focus on a restoration effort up here was because of the proximity of this already existing population. So we assumed that there would be some natural immigration from these populations to occupy the better habitats here. And this was some evidence that that was the case, right? There it is. And then since 2005, we started picking several up. I didn't put individual dots, but there were several here scattered around like, well, something's going on up there. We've got a booming population. And then lo and behold, in 2010, we had two down here. Both of them were actually trap-related takes. The trappers down here had just assumed they weren't there. So they weren't taking any precautions in their fisher traps, not thinking that they needed to. So in 2010, we had two different marten taken down there, which again, as sad as that is, was like, oh my gosh, there's marten down there still. we got to check this out. And we'll look at it a little closer here. Again, this is Somerset Reservoir. This is the southern part of the reintroduction sites. We did have these red dates here were animals that presented themselves, whether I guess body in hand or photo somehow, that were released animals. And then in 2002, actually a department employee saw one while deer hunting in the Glastonbury Wilderness. Didn't get a picture of it, so I can't confirm it. But I know the employee, and I totally, at this point especially, believe that's what he saw. But back in 2002, before we had any other evidence, we're like, he saw a red squirrel. 2005, we had a trapper who I know fairly well and who's a phenomenal trapper. He's an older gentleman who'd been trapping his whole life, including trapping for marten in other jurisdictions where they had populations that were legally harvested. And when he calls and says, I saw marten tracks, and I say, okay, well, we're listening now. But again, it's hard to confirm tracks. He was adamant. He's like, I can tell mink from marten. This is a marten track. But again, it wasn't a confirmation. And then in 2010, we had two different trappers, one guy trapping down in this area, obviously, and another up here, who called us a day apart and said, I caught a marten. And we were like, oh, the world's coming down. No more catching marten, you know. But it all worked out in, as you'll see, or it's working itself out. So that's the same reintroduction circle, and this was the northern incidental take site. I wanted to get out there and find out, do we have a detectable population, right? I mean, obviously there's some animals down there, but is it a detectable population? Can I just go out and detect marten out there? I didn't think so because, I mean, we hadn't, you know, it'd been a decade since we had any evidence of these animals. So I went down with a technician, and she and I set 4 cameras, these red dots, baited and scent lured, specifically designed for marten. So this is a cylindrical cage with the camera mounted at the top of it facing down, and the bait wired to the bottom of the cage. So marten come up the tree, looking right up into the camera. You get a facial shot, and then they sit there and eat the bait, and you get 100, 300, in some cases 1,000 different photos of the marten as it persists there. So we set those out for just a matter of a few weeks before we checked them, and then within a few weeks' time, we had 2 different marten. This is the distance here would eliminate them from being the same. Plus, they were different sizes, I'm pretty sure, but all but 100% certain that they were different marten. And then this one was tracks, and again, these were my observations, and even I didn't feel comfortable to confirm it, but I'm pretty darn sure that those were marten tracks up there at that camera site. It didn't go into the camera set. So yeah, we had a detectable population. Potentially three individual animals within a few weeks' time is really a detectable population. You can set multiple cameras out over months and not get one of these animals.
Is it suspected that they're from the original?
From the release?
Yeah.
Well, we're going to get to that, actually. So we then engaged, this was bigger than our capacity to do internally. So we go to the Forest Service to partner with them. We partner with our academic institutions. Paul Haitman here is a professor at CCSU. He did his PhD work with Bill Kilpatrick at the University of Vermont, and Kim Royer, my predecessor that I've talked about several times already, working on fisher genetics, and he has a specific interest in mustelids. So it made sense to go to him and say, hey, we'd like to do some occupancy modeling. We need to figure out where these animals are. That's the most fundamental information. So every one of these polygons here is a unit. They're randomly selected across our study area. This is the study area. And the reintroduction site was right there. This is Route 11, crossing through to Manchester over here. So Somerset Reservoir, Glastonbury Mountain. So every one of these units had 6 randomly allocated game cameras in it, all baited and scent lured for marten. That's a lot of cameras. They weren't set out all at once, so we rotated. I think we never had more than 6 units set out. Each unit was established out there for 15 days. So we had 3 checks. So we had the set, we bait it, scent lure it, put it out. And then we had a follow-up check 5 days later where it was rebaited, rescent lured, and then another check, rebaited, rescent lured, and then a final check or pull. And I'm telling you, this is remote terrain. We hired a young gal out of New York who was working for Paul Jensen, their fur bearer biologist and a marten expert. She was running a camera trap line for him. And she was moving to Vermont for other reasons, and he said, you got to hire this gal. I said, I got a job for you. You're going to run cameras in the wilderness. Has the best job on earth as far as I'm concerned. And she's still doing this work for us. She was out here today. But anyway, I babble on, sorry. So every one of these, like I said, 6 cameras, 15 days, rotated around. The red ones here were the areas where we picked up marten using that protocol. And what's striking to me is that it's everywhere. Every camera in that polygon, we got marten, nothing else around it. It's 184 square kilometers. It's a relatively small area. If you know, that's not going to have many marten in that kind of terrain there. If you remember back to I'll go down that road. So there's something limiting this population. 10 years out, 20 years out to present. And then this is the distribution of Fisher out those same cameras. The difference here is that these dots are actually the camera location within the polygon at which the Fisher was detected. So we have Fisher at all units except for that one. Unless that, well, actually maybe that one goes down in there. I think it does. So I think we had Fisher at every unit, at least one camera, in some units, multiple cameras. Now you have to be careful. You can't infer density of Fisher here, right? Because you can't tell individuals apart. Fisher in particular, there's no like throat patch or some sort of unique identifier. Sometimes by size you can tell. So you might have one Fisher that comes into your camera 1,000 times. It's one Fisher, or you could have 10 that come in, 100 times. So, there may be actually, in fact, less Fisher here than are in the periphery. In fact, that would be my belief, because this is the core of the marten habitat, the highest elevation. And then when you get around here, it drops down into the Deerfield Valley and through like Route 9 corridor. I guess that's down here, sorry. No. Yeah, that's the Route 9 corridor right through there. And we had multiple, this is the set. We used sardines, which is great because you can pack sardines in a backpack into the woods and they're nice and clean. You put it on the tree, you wire it to the tree and poke holes in it. And we put a second can of sardines, the reward, on the ground, opened up and dumped it on the ground. And then on the tree, we smeared what they call magic marten. It's a gland lure for marten, and then a skunk lure, which is really, really potent. The skunk lure is a long distance call. So animals can smell that a long way away. They get in closer, then they can smell the gland lure, and they get even more curious, and they can smell the sardines, and then they're in there. So it's a series of lures. Yeah.
Did you say before that Fisher prey on marten?
That has absolutely been definitively documented. Absolutely, yeah.
And then the other thing I was wondering, is there any way to collect DNA of individual animals that you can recognize?
You're getting ahead of me.
Okay, so like in hairs or something?
Look at this. Genetic legacies of translocations of isolated relic populations of American marten. That's a big title there. But so this is a graduate student. He just learned this week that his work is going to be published in the Animal Conservation Journal, which is awesome. This is James Murdoch, Dr. Murdoch at UVM, and Dr. Kilpatrick. And so we partnered with, Vermont Fish and Wildlife partnered with UVM. We had at this point 27 marten from Vermont, from roadkill and the incidental take and the traps throughout the whole state, most of which were from the Northeast Kingdom, only a handful from southern Vermont. So we had some Vermont samples, and then I peddled myself to my colleagues in New Hampshire, Maine, and New York, Corey Mosby, the Maine's fur bear biologist, Jill Kilborn, a New Hampshire biologist, and Paul Jensen in New York, to get them to get samples for me. So they went to their trappers, and in Maine they actually targeted trappers who took animals for this reintroduction. Literally the trappers who live trapped the Fisher for us collected marten. They, on their trap lines in modern day, were collecting DNA samples for us for marten up there, so we could really compare. Well, I think this map shows. Yeah, it does, right here. Sorry. So we basically got DNA samples from here, from the Adirondacks, where the 11 animals came from New York, and then from all of northern New Hampshire. And there were two principal hypotheses that we were testing here. And one deals with southern Vermont, the other was the northeast animals up here. So this is a little bit confusing, but the red here is the primary hypothesis and the blue is the alternative. And so looking at this first one, we hypothesized primarily that the reintroduction, or the southern Vermont animals, were a result of the reintroduction effort from New York, from Maine. And that's what established them. The alternative hypothesis was that they naturally immigrated from this persistent population up here, down the spine of the greens. Similarly here, now looking at the northeast population as the focal point, the principal or primary hypothesis was that it's just natural immigration from the estuary region of Quebec and northern New Hampshire, that's what's populated here, or alternatively, that the animals, because we had some evidence of that one that went through Rangeley, probably came through here, that the reintroduced animals scattered and some ended up recolonizing northeast Vermont. So we wanted to test that. And so we found several things which are really kind of cool. One, as expected, the genetic makeup of these animals down here was really made up of the Maine DNA that shared the most commonality with the Maine sample. The New York sample had no match. Again, 11 animals. It's not surprising that there's no match. And I think they were all males as well. So take that for what it is. The thing that's important down here is that there was, well, there's also no comparison and no commonality between northern New Hampshire and the southern Vermont. So that kind of threw that hypothesis out. But the interesting thing is that there were genes in this population down here that were not found anywhere else in the study area. And Dr. Kilpatrick and Cody Howard and Dr. Murdoch said, you know, it's possible that we never lost them fully out of that region, that they just limped along undetected, that there was a relic population there. And so that makes that reintroduction effort an augmentation. So it's a breathing new genes into it, which is good, particularly for a population that would have been relic for that length of time, with likely no genetic input. That's a possibility. You know, the sample sizes are pretty thin down here, like I said, so it's hard to say for certain, but it's certainly possible. And the other thing that was interesting is, getting back to this one, is that as we figured, the majority of the animals up here shared commonality with these animals, so it was natural immigration. But there was also some influence of these animals via Maine, boop, boop, to this population. So in fact, these animals did influence the Northeast Kingdom population, which is great. So this work, although it's pretty much finalized for now and being prepared for publication, is awesome, but it's going to continue. There's still some things, you know, like the relic population, for example. There's still some things we want to figure out there, and we're contemplating ways of going about that. The collaboration with Central Connecticut State University and Paul Heitman, same. We're gearing up for even a more robust occupancy model, working with the Forest Service to look more closely at habitat conditions in those areas where marten have been documented, to see if there's some correlation there, which we suspect there will be. But at any rate, we're doing a lot of work in that regard. That's being stepped up in the next few years. So I feel like we're making good progress, and albeit a small population down there in southern Vermont, it is certainly robust where it is. I mean, you go out and set a camera, you get a track. I mean, you get a photo. So I'll end the next few slides with just some of the challenges. And I want to start with the trapping one because I've talked a lot about that already. And I just want to make it clear, I want people to understand the degrees of challenges that we have to deal with here. This is the easiest challenge that we have on our plate to deal with. Number one, there's a handful of trappers that are in these areas where marten exist. I know them all personally. They call me with questions. They call and have ideas of how to keep marten out of their traps. They are engaged, and they're creative. In fact, I've been working with trappers in southern Vermont, actually and northern Vermont, to design a system that would keep fisher out of a trap. Keep marten out of a fisher trap. So this was an idea that came about from those discussions, which again I think is ingenious, and we're looking at testing this more robustly. So this gets mounted on a tree. The trap, you can see these slots here. The trap gets put in here, and then you wire your beaver and your scent lures and all that stuff right in there. You flip that up, put that down, and then take your zip ties and clamp that down tight so that bait is completely enclosed now. A marten comes up, and there's a little hole here. We're talking about what size hole they need. This is a 2-inch hole, and a marten can get right into that and actually get into the cage and eat the bait. A larger fisher comes up, and it can't get its head through that. And it keeps on trying, and it maybe can lick the bait, which is going to just drive it nuts. It comes down and goes into the top and gets caught. Now, we've tested a handful of these in a piloting, and they have promise. They work. I got video of marten coming and going, never going to the trap end, eat all the bait. And it was within, don't quote me on this, but I want to say it was within 10 minutes of the first fisher coming in, it was in the trap end. And there was no trap in it. We didn't, for piloting, we're not going to put a trap in it, but we have a video on it. So there's some promise there, and the trappers are eager to work with us in that regard. The second thing to understand about trapping is that, beyond just a few people and their eagerness to work with us, is the fact that one of the reasons why we may even have marten in southern Vermont is because of harvest of fisher. It's possible. That's really hard to prove empirically, and we've bantered around different ways of trying to get at that through research, but it's a challenge for a variety of reasons, which we'll save for another conversation. But when you look at the literature on marten, it's widely theorized, and in some cases even documented, that fisher are a limiting factor for the species. And so we want to be careful that whatever we do here, that we don't lose that tool of being able to harvest fisher from these areas for marten conservation purposes. That's a key part of the puzzle. The other, and this is kind of stems right from the fisher conversation, but competition and predation. So it's not just fisher, it's fox as well have been documented to predate marten, which is a little weird, but there it is. And we know we've got fox throughout the state as well.
Gray fox climb trees.
They do. Although I don't know that we've ever documented a gray fox.
In that same habitat.
There's a little bit of a broader petitioning of habitat. That would be one thing. And I just don't know. I don't think there's ever been any documentation of a gray fox predating marten. So where the documentation for red fox predation comes from is from Alexei Siren. He's a PhD fellow at the Northeast Climate Science Center at UMass. We've been collaborating with him on Canada Lynx work. But he did his master's work at the Kelsey Mountain site in northern New Hampshire, which was the site of a proposed wind facility, a big wind facility. It actually relates to this slide probably even a little bit better, habitat degradation. So they knew, and marten were an endangered species up until this past year in New Hampshire. They just got delisted. So they deemed them recovered in New Hampshire. But he did his master's back when they were still listed as an endangered species. And they knew that these mountains that were destined for wind turbines housed marten. And they wanted to know, well, how does a wind turbine facility affect marten? And so that was the focus of his research. And so he had cameras and did a whole bunch of stuff. We won't go down the path of describing it all. But suffice it to say, he documented when they built the roads up into the high elevation and plowed them, those road systems became an avenue for animals which wouldn't otherwise be able to get up into the high elevation because of the snow. And so during the winter, animals like fox and coyote, although I don't think he documented coyote predation, but he documented coyote at elevations with deep snow where they wouldn't be normally. And fox would actually follow his snowshoe tracks to his, up the road and onto a snowshoe track to his study sites where he'd go out and telemeter, for the radio telemetry, radio-collared marten. And I don't know how many. I think that he's got that published at this point, or it's working toward that. But anyway, competition, predation, habitat degradation, it's both the physical degradation of the habitat and then the indirect, like we just talked about with marten, with red fox. There's a lot of things that can affect these species that are on the balance to begin with. And I think the most, and probably the most obvious, is just a changing climate. However it manifests itself, we can't tell for certain right now, but if it manifests itself with less snow and warmer winters, that will not bode well for marten. It won't bode well for lynx, because it'll give those other species like bobcat and fisher an edge during those critical times of the year, and that's not going to bode well. Those are the big challenges. Now you can see, going back through those last few slides, why I say trapping is really the easiest one we've got. And we're working on that. But I wanted to say that I hate leaving a presentation on the challenges ahead, because I run the risk of souring you all. Now you're going to go forth and think of Chris Bernier as this doomsday guy, and I'm not. But it is a deliberate decision that I do, because I want to leave people with the notion that, this is an all hands on deck challenge. This is not just the Vermont Fish and Wildlife Department. This is everybody. We all bear responsibility for the future of these animals with our everyday decisions about the resources that we use, with the organizations we support. You think of Otter Creek Audubon, for example, and all the good work that they do. Your local conservation commissions getting involved. There's so many things that we can do as a people to collectively combat these things that really are going to be the things that make the difference in the long run. And so it's an important point to leave. I want you to leave thinking about, well, maybe I should get involved in the Conservation Commission, or maybe I should support organizations like Vermont Fish and Wildlife or Otter Creek Audubon. And there's a whole host of organizations that do excellent work in this respect. I'll leave it at that, and I'll just run through a handful of photos that are select from some of the CCSU, the Central Connecticut State Study, that I thought are particularly endearing. This is a fisher. Fisher will eat that can of sardines. The can. They're an amazing animal, and I say these things at the risk of demonizing them or making people afraid. They're not. They're super cool animals. They're just all about their stomachs. There's a coyote just wondering, what on earth is a can of sardines doing up there?
Are there stuffed animals such as that down in the southern Vermont area that predate, that are old?
No.
Could be used
Yeah, for
as
DNA. No. There may be a few, but if...
Would it be too degraded?
Yeah, I just think that the fur, I've never come across any other marten mounts. People typically know where mounts come from, but the furs that may be out and about, once they get out and about, there's no way of documenting where they've come from. Yeah, and it's a trade. It's all over. There's a bobcat slinking away there, and you can see that little tip of white on the rear end there. We actually got a lot of bobcats. Bears have an affinity for sardines, as it turns out, and scratching their back on these. Yeah. There's another marten. I thought that there were two in here, but I'm not sure that there were. But it's actually not one of the better photos of the marten that we've got. A moose running through, and I like this guy. Why is there a skunk out here? Or sardines. So that is all I have. Yeah. Thank you. Any questions? They are. They're, like I said, they're the cutest animal of the whole suite that we deal with. Yeah.
Do you know anybody who has tamed marten or fisher, and just what they're like is?
No, I've never come across that. Tamed them, you said, right? No.
Or like tamed a weasel or whatever.
Well, ferret, which is also another weasel family, you know, there's a domesticated line of ferret.
I've heard that they make great cabin pets. I mean, you know, the fur trappers and people that lived up in the mountains occasionally fed them, you know,
Oh, yeah.
adopted them. And I haven't actually seen that, but I've read it. But I have seen wolverines being domesticated. There's several people that, oh, you didn't know this?
No.
Get on YouTube and check this out. There's a guy in Canada that raises wolverines.
Yeah.
And they wrestle with his kids.
Yikes.
And then there was a guy in Europe, I think it was in Sweden. He was the first a procurement specialist for a zoo, but then he got to raising wolverines and releasing them in the wild in a certain area in Sweden.
For restoration.
This was back in the 40s and 50s.
Yeah.
But he raised with his kids, and they would rough and tumble. There's all sorts of pictures of these. And wolverines make great pets. You wouldn't believe it. But
Well, I have a hard time believing it, but I will believe you on that.
it'll blow your mind.
Let me know how it works out.
See if they
Yeah.
mature with 10 fingers.
Would you be surprised? I was very sure that I saw a marten
Yeah?
up in Lincoln on the Emily Proctor Trail.
It's good to know.
Up in a tree, looking down at me, I had my dog.
So
And I looked at it for a long time. I got a good view of it.
I want to talk with you and get the details of that. So I failed to mention that we have, in addition to the UVM genetic work and the CCSU camera work, we also have a system of cameras pretty much up the spine all through the Green Mountain National Forest, again in partnership with the Green Mountain National Forest. They're set at a 64 square kilometer grid, which is really a lynx. The primary species of target there is lynx, but that same protocol is being applied across the Northeast Kingdom and all of northern New Hampshire. And in northern New Hampshire, where they have sympatric or co-occurring lynx and marten, they get marten all the time on those same cameras. So even though we're focusing those cameras for lynx, my hope is that they're out monitoring for marten right now. We haven't picked any up. But when you look at the landscape and you think about the habitat characteristics that this animal needs, the deep forest, you know, the high elevation snows and so on and so forth, it only makes sense that they would go up the spine, right? So they were reestablished in southern Vermont, and they've been dispersing ever since.
They got the name somehow.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's right up the spine. And so it's entirely possible. And normally, I would direct people to our website, vermontfishandwildlife.com. We have a reporting system for these things, for Canada lynx and marten. It's fairly easy to find. Unfortunately, our website is going to be down for a while. We have some contractual issues with our vendor. I'm not sure of the details, but at some point in the near future, it will be back up, and that link will be available, and you can just go and put your observations right in. It's proved very fruitful for us. We've had a lot of sightings generated as a result of that, and even some confirmed sightings, which is great.
I wanted to point out that this woman also thought she saw a black-footed ferret on one of our spotted owl study site in New Mexico.
Which is possible?
District.
Is it?
Yeah, but we had a biologist come and check it out, did a superficial survey, but
Yeah.
there may have been black-footed ferrets up there.
Yeah.
Never know.
It's you know, I have the distinct pleasure of being the recipient of most animal sightings of note in the state. So mountain lions, wolves. Last week I took a wolverine sighting. No joking aside. I don't know why, but maybe because part of me enjoys it, I guess, talking to people. It's really people's excitement, even though I'm pretty sure they didn't see a wolverine. You know, given where we are and how close they are to us, several thousand miles away. But my point is that, no, I don't even remember what my point was. What was my point? Help me out. No, I've learned over time that, you know, you can't say never on it. It's just, there's just too many nuances out there. You know, who knows? These animals move. We had the mountain lion that was killed on the road in Connecticut in 2011, a wild mountain lion that came out of South Dakota. That's an 1,800-mile journey, straight as an arrow. It certainly didn't walk straight. You know, it ultimately ended up dead. It left a trail of evidence all along its path. You can go online and find it. It's great stuff. DNA, scat, photos, I think a video of it. But, you know, that animal could have come through Vermont. And one of the calls that I got on mountain lions could have been that animal. So you just can't say never. And, you know, those first, if you recall the slide that I had of southern Vermont that had those early detections, they were color-coded, the 2 red, the 2 green, and the 2 yellow. Those yellow ones, the 2002 sighting and the 2005 sighting, you know, those didn't end up being, you know, again, never say never. I mean, we didn't take them as serious, I guess, as I would now, knowing, you know, that constantly surprised by these things. Yeah.
Do fisher populations vary, or what is the fisher population doing in general? It seems like a few years before the 2 hard winters that we had a couple of winters ago, I saw fisher tracks in the woods all the time, and now I
Rarely see them.
year or 2 I haven't seen them.
Yeah, good question. And marten follow this same pattern as well. So they're really tied to the small mammal community. So when you have a series of successive years of incredible mast production, so acorns, beech, soft mast, berries, apples, all that kind of stuff, you have a corresponding boom in the small mammal population. And then a little delayed from that, you have a boom in the fisher population. If you have a bad winter, it's going to counteract some of that boom and bust. So there's a lot of factors that play into it. But fisher are very cyclical. And one thing that I've observed in the years that I've been here in Vermont and doing all this kind of stuff is that I'll see porcupine sign, and you know, it's like all of a sudden there's porcupines everywhere. You go out there and you see porcupines, you go to another site visit there, there's porcupines, and there's no fisher. And then a year later you come back, and it's all fisher and no porcupines. I don't know, maybe some of you will see that same pattern now that I've laid it out there for you to recognize it, but fisher are one of the only animals that will actually target porcupine. It's a prey item that they target. Bobcat will eat porcupine as well, not quite as successfully, but fisher will actually actively hunt porcupine habitat for them. And so they are the check and balance. But you're right, you will see their population ebb and flow. There's been concern in neighboring jurisdictions with decreasing fisher populations. They're not sure what's driving it. So again, when you talk about a decrease in population, it's a trend over time. All these populations, all wildlife, are up and down all the time, from year to year, even within the year, they're up and down. Every year, you know, an animal like marten that has 1 to 5 young, if they have a good year and every female has 5 young, well, your population just quadrupled in the season. By the time it comes around to the following breeding season, it's probably back to what it was close to before. But at any rate, so you have to look at long-term trends. And there are some concerns for fisher. We haven't seen it in any of our data in Vermont as of yet, and we are watching. We've been discussing different disease monitoring.
What about ticks?
I don't know that ticks are a particular issue for fisher. I've never documented.
Possums are supposed to be the tick magnet, and
But they eat them, yeah.
eat 'em.
Right.
So you would think that fisher
Oh,
or they would groom themselves a lot as well.
Yeah, I've never heard a trapper say anything about Fisher or marten, or not marten, but any of the fur bearers loaded with ticks. I've never seen it. I've never heard of it. So,
'Cause that goes with the rodent, increase
Right.
in rodent.
absolutely, yeah. Yeah,
I'm guessing from your talk that the Kelly Scan Road has been rebuilt?
yes,
Okay.
yeah. It was devastated during Irene, Tropical Storm Irene.
I used to live right there, and I just want to suggest to everybody, if you're ever in East Arlington, take a wrong turn and go
Yeah.
up the hill, because it's wild and beautiful.
It is. It really is a beautiful part of the state. You can get lost in there pretty easily. Yeah,
Do you know Bird's Eye Mountain near Fairhaven?
I certainly do, yeah.
Okay, well, all of Route 4, I traveled it many, many years, because lots and lots of roadkill, it's hard to say.
Yeah,
I'm wondering,
right where Blueberry Hill on the north and Bird's Eye or Bird Mountain on the south,
yeah.
like that corridor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Just the whole valley, I just wondered if Bird's Eye Mountain has been looked at as habitat for these little.
We're looking further south in the Taconics. We've partnered with the Equinox Preservation Trust, I think it is, the organization that oversees the Equinox Mountain outside of Manchester. And my wife and I, my technician has been up there a bunch with them, and she claims it's great habitat. So I went out, never hiked it. So my wife and I this past year hiked it, and I couldn't believe how good a quality the marten habitat was on that mountain.
And you're talking about now Manchester?
Yeah, that's further south from Bird's Eye, but it's still part of the Taconics. I keep calling it Bird's Eye. It's Bird Mountain. I think of Bird Mountain as being kind of the northern terminus of the Taconics. That may not be just, but from Equinox, you get a great vista of the Taconics in their entirety. And I think it's possible in some of those pockets that if marten were to get into them, that they could become established. The question is whether it's enough of an area that they would have a population robust enough to carry them through time. You know, that's the key, is to have a critical mass of marten for them to kind of thrive through time.
Also, I was wondering if you can say, if you have documentation of a marten, does that by definition mean that there's at least one or two others around? You know what I mean? Like
If you're picking them up on camera
Well,
or detectable population?
Like if you detect one,
Mm-hmm.
does that mean there are probably two others that are not getting detected?
Well, not necessarily. So again, think back to the map that I showed of those early detections in southern Vermont that were color-coded. You remember there was one incidental take of a marten further south? That was south of Route 9. And so when we looked at it, we're like, oh, this is awesome. We even have marten south of Route 9. Well, that was part of the CCSU study area. We blanketed that area with cameras and never picked up a marten. So that one marten, what that tells me, was a disperser. And you know, that's what happens. They satellite out from a core population. Sometimes they get into good habitat and meet up with others of their species and establish themselves, but more often than not, they perish either of old age or of whatever. And animals perish all the time for a whole host of things. But it's interesting stuff. You had a question too, I think?
Yeah, I wondered about your feelings on the leg hole trap,
As far as the
controversy that surrounds it.
Well, I'll say openly that I recognize that people have a wide array of feelings about foothold traps. And I understand that. However, I mean, being in the position that I'm in, I have experience with and knowledge of foothold traps that most people don't have, other than trappers themselves. And I see the utility of them as a tool. I see, you know, how they can function both for terms of research or animal management, but for also harvesting animals. And I'm also, one of the projects that I got involved in my career here was the best management practices of trapping in the United States. It's a research project started in, well, I think it had its roots in the mid-90s. And I think 43 states across the country participated in it. It's arguably one of the largest wildlife research projects ever done. And the sole purpose of the study was to evaluate the animal welfare of trap types of all, not just footholds, but a whole bunch of different trap types. and modifications thereof. So the idea was to drive or to come up with new ways of designing them that would improve animal welfare. So for example, prior to the study, none had padded jaws. So now you can easily find a padded jaw trap in any sort of trap supplier, or offset, so the jaw is actually not, it doesn't close tight. It actually has a space. It's an offset. Those are now what trappers who are coming into it are buying. They're BMP traps. And so it's an evolution of the tool. It's not the big bear clawed, tooth thing of yesterday. And it's continuing. The BMPs continue. And we're looking more at selectivity. So and welfare still is a part of it, but focusing more on selectivity, how to make them even more selective. And there's been a lot of work already done on that. I didn't bring my gig bag of traps. I wasn't anticipating a discussion on trapping per se, but I normally have with me a variety of BMP traps to show people, and often they're like, oh yeah, I get that. I'm not suggesting that every trapper's using a BMP trap. They're not regulated, but it's an evolution. And as new trappers come into it, they buy the BMPs. That's what we teach in our trapper education. That's what we promote. So again, there's a variety of things. I see the utility of them. I understand the need for having different tools, and I've been a part of, proudly, and anticipate further an evolution of trapping that gets at animal welfare to the greatest extent possible. But at the end of the day, it is to catch animals, and that's its intent, for research, for harvest, for what have you, and that for a lot of people is where they fall out on it, and I get that, and that's a personal choice.
Where's that fur going?
Today, most of the fur, as I understand it, is overseas markets. So China,
Specifically China?
yeah, China, Russia, Korea is a big market. It all goes through the European Union and then back out. What is sad, again, we're kind of getting into a little bit of not a pigeonhole, but a different topic, and it'd be good to do a whole presentation on it because it is fascinating. But we look at all of our clothing choices, and I'm looking around right now. I'm wearing fleece. I see a number of folks wearing fleece. That's oil. We're all wearing cotton. I can tell you that that's the most intensive. I think it's like 11 million acres of cotton in the states, the United States, that are harvested annually on average. It's the most water-hungry and most pesticide-hungry crop that there is. And if a beaver ends up in a cotton plantation, I can guarantee you it's going to be dead by morning. So it's not free of impact, is my point. So all of our choices in this respect have an impact. And when you look at fur, and again, I'm not trying to convince people that they should go out and buy fur. I'm not. But it is a fiber choice. Sadly, it's not utilized as a sustainable, natural, local, organic source of fiber that it is. It's not being used to the degree that it could be in a managed and regulated way that we have now. This is not the Middle Ages. This is not the 1300s where it's unregulated. We have incredible systems and rules, and it's an evolution. They're getting better. They're not getting worse in place to manage these things. And I would contend that it probably, for our own sustainability, we probably ought to look at fur more closely for ourselves. This is oil. And it's a bit of an embarrassment to me in some respects that this is what my department, I'm not speaking poorly to the Department of Fish and Wildlife, but this is what they bought me for, my department. Like, it really should be a beaver fleece, a nuisance animal that was, plugging someone's culvert. Right? Because it's gonna, this is the point. It's about choices and sustainability. And well, there's another choice, right?
It's just about free as you can get.
Yeah, but I would venture to say that if we were to produce hemp at the quantity that we would need it to take, other options off the table, that it itself would have impacts too. Nothing is free of impact in this world. At the quantity that we need the stuff today, nothing is free of impact. But one of the things that I do like about fur that is harder to get your arms around with these other fiber sources is that it does firmly connect a portion of our human community to the land. So the people who are out there, and you all know them, which is, it's hard to imagine, but you do, they're out there, that are out in those habitats, up to their elbows in beaver flowage or out in the Glastonbury wilderness or what have you, that are interacting with their natural world, observing, understanding. When I need to know what's going on with some of these populations, I turn to trappers. They're the ones that have that knowledge. They're the ones that came to us and said, there's something going on with the muskrat population. What's happening? Well, we think that there's been a recovery of a lot of birds of prey in recent decades. And the muskrat population has changed accordingly because they're a prey item, both behaviorally and population-wise. Anyway, this is, again, a great topic for another presentation. And it's not an easy one because it's really deep-rooted convictions. You're talking about people's, ethics and on and on and on. It's a hard conversation, but there's some important points that often get glossed over in that conversation that really need to be considered.
I think we'll stop here because we'll let people get too past their bedtimes.
Thank you.